James Wan just has horror in his blood. I think we can all agree on that. Him and Lee were now bringing out Saw and then going on to do countless solo projects, continuing to make waves within the horror genre that they were both always destined for. One of the most successful projects, thanks to James Wan specifically, is of course The Conjuring, released in 2012, which then spawned what I think can only be considered the only successful horror cinematic universe. An immensely successful franchise which has now come to an end, seemingly. So let's look back at where it all started and the progression of the main four, because I don't want to watch the rest of them. Oh, we're doing one of these. Went through a bit of a phase of claiming to be true events. I mean, the idea wasn't new. The Blair Witch Project did that, and it was completely fictional, likewise with Paranormal Activity, but it was made to be a part of the narrative. There were other cases, like the Amityville movies, which was also a case covered by Ed and Lorraine Warren, which actually does come up in these movies too. And because of this, one of the biggest selling points became the Annabelle doll, which would somehow get its own trilogy before the main titles, but a doll that looks nothing like the real-life counterparts. But either way, it was very well known and became even more so after the release of this film. And so these films play on that. And after the amount of success that this first film brought in and would continue to through the Annabelle trilogy, you just have to look at the numbers and you can see that it was a really smart decision from the creatives. I think the actual case of the Perron family was a lesser known one, especially in comparison to the following two, but nonetheless, there are still records of this family. What was an effective marketing strategy and tone setter has become a more controversial topic of conversation though over the last few years. They bank heavily on this based on a true story despite the fact it's incredibly dramatized, and even though there are cases in these locations and with names of protagonists like Ed and Lorraine and the Perrons and the Hodgsons, there was never anything such as the Crooked Man or the Nun. And as I already said, Annabelle looked entirely different. And admittedly, in the first film, the demon Bathsheba is a real named individual. But through pretty easy and quick historic research, you can see that there's no evidence or correlation of the real recorded Bathsheba being any kind of murderer or witch. It was just something that got built from folklore. One of the Perron children actually stated that the first film is about 95% fiction, and I think that's a pretty good rule to go into all of these films. There may be sprinkles and seeds of moments based on the true events and cases, but whether they're real at all, in any way, is an entirely separate and controversial conversation. Whereas this aspect for the movies, it is more of a backdrop, which for me is perfectly fine. I don't really have an issue with them doing that. I think bridging the dramatized fictional sequences and ideas based off the documented case adds a different layer of horror. I think the films do a good job at making it clear with their tones and execution not to see this as a representation of what really happened. It really is nothing more than some names and foundational locations. But all this to say, when talking about these films, I am going to be essentially viewing them as total fiction, because they might as well be. They're close enough. Ed and Lorraine for definite are not the people that Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga portray. I hate to say it, but after looking into them for a bit, the exploitative accusations against them have a lot of value. There is also a heavy accusation against Ed surrounding abuse with a 15-year-old, so I'd highly recommend you do your own research to form your own opinions on the real live people. Because for all intensive purposes, Farmiga and Wilson are portraying entirely fictional characters, the only similarity being the names. And that does make me think maybe they should have just made people up. Maybe they should have included fictional names for everyone and just used the actual cases as the foundation to build on. You know, have the Enfield haunting, have the Perron family haunting, have that location and that case. Use the real life events as a basis for the plot, but use fictional characters. I think that maybe could have been a smarter choice, but hey, that's not what the films were interested in.
Give us a sign that you want to communicate with us.
The first Conjuring movie is a pretty simple horror by all accounts really, but manages to stand out through the stylistic and effortlessly effective execution of its scares, with an engaging story and charismatic lead characters all throughout. The narrative is paced very well, how we follow the Perrons and the Warrens separately before the storylines converge, establishing a family used to normality in comparison to the Warrens' experienced lifestyle is really effective at engaging us both separately. They bring us down to earth with the family in particular because you genuinely care about them, they're so normal. Carolyn is the main subject of the family, really. We spend most time getting to know her, and she is the one who is kind of tormented the most, so that makes sense. And on that note, her slowly progressing possession is really quite scary. It's very well done. Some great makeup that piles up throughout the film, especially in the latter half. She feels pushed to the edge and drained of life, whilst the rest of the family are infused with disbelief and terror. So we should talk about the actual scares, the big selling point for all of these films.
Listen. My name is Ed Warren. It's November 1st, 1971. I'm sitting here with Carolyn Perron, who, with her family, has been experiencing supernatural occurrences. All right, go ahead.
Any of these little fuckers ever pop out of the fucking wall and say, fuck, there's a horse cock in my room or a donkey dick?
The Conjuring series is undoubtedly a part of the jump scare heavy genre of horror, and I think relatively rightfully so, that is looked down on. But the Conjuring films stand above the rest of the slop. I mean, the same can't be said for the likes of Annabelle, but you know, that's why we're not watching those ones. The emphasized sound design and camera movements are really creative, used to divert attention and subvert where we expect the scare to come from, and it progresses throughout the film the more the paranormal terror goes on. One of the most famous sequences from the film being the hide and clap scare, having been established early in the film as a game that Carolyn plays with the kids, and it gets weaponized against us in this sequence. We had a hint of the ghosts using this against them earlier in the film, and something that I like about this film is how the jump scares aren't just there to make us jump, they're actually there with a reason to tear down, particularly in this case, Carolyn. The weaker they are, the easier it is to possess the body. I like that we actually get kind of lore and story about inhuman spirits and a difference between those and actual ghosts. The beauty of how these scares are crafted is seen no better than the wardrobe jump scare. The film has drawn attention to this closet, with the youngest child banging her head against it multiple times throughout the film. And on this specific night, once again, she's doing that same thing. But it seems that something's inside the closet, and that's where your mind will naturally go in this scenario as well. And so we follow one of the kids go to open the closet. We await patiently for whatever is beneath the clothes, and when she opens it, there's nothing there. She rummages through, and there's still nothing there. The film gives us a moment to breathe, like, oh, we're okay. And then the tiny little pan up, and we see Bathsheba on top of the closet, and she leaps down onto one of the girls. A truly terrifying subversion of expectations, a top tier jump scare, and whilst the longer hide and clap sequence after this is also very effective, this scene just about tops it for me. The simplicity of moving the scare from in the closet to above just does wonders. The film knows exactly what we expect and plays on that so well, and the timing is just impeccable. That being said, the sequence where Carolyn does find herself locked in the basement is brilliant. As I say, weaponizing the game, that mechanism that was used earlier in the film, this time going even harder with it. As we realize it's the demon and not one of the kids again, we are filled with dread with where it's going to go this time round. We go further and further down the house until we end up in the basement, and the door slams shut, locking Carolyn in with no one else in the house. Terrifying all in of itself, right? And with just the flame from a match being the only piece of visibility we have available, the scare once again comes from where we least expect, because from what we've just seen, it's a physical impossibility. The two claps appear from behind Carolyn, which, as we know, is just a wall. So this thing just apparated within the shadow. It's so effective because we're waiting for something to come from the depths of the basement, but no, it's right next to Carolyn at the top. The eventual actual possession, after wearing Carolyn down enough, is very gross and scarily done. Set up with a great scare as we see Bathsheba taunting Lorraine from the window. The almost casual way Bathsheba glides over Carolyn, then vomiting in her mouth, is nothing less than sickening to watch. And we know immediately from her reaction to Lorraine when she asks about her well-being, her immediate dismissal of what has just happened implements a dread that would remain throughout the rest of the film. We continue escalating, and the physical transformation that Carolyn experiences is pretty disturbing. The moment where Nancy is grabbed by the hair is pure insanity as she's thrown across the damn room. They're all great visual effects as well, and it gets to the point where they decide to leave the house for their own safety, whilst Ed and Lorraine approach the church for an exorcism. But things worsen way too quickly, and when Carolyn leaves the motel with the kids, forcing Ed and Lorraine to act themselves, and fast. This all leads to a great final act where Ed is forced to take the exorcist position. If they don't act now, one, if not more, of this family is going to die. There's personal stakes, there's high-octane horror as this possession takes over and we see a mother attempt to take the life of her own child. A very unsettling picture in any scenario. There's some great visuals here with the floating chair and the blooded bedsheet, slowly ripping to reveal an eye, despite hell itself seemingly surrounding the home at this point. Ed successfully performs the exorcism, returning Carol into her body and sending Bathsheba back to hell. A genuinely triumphant moment after keeping us on the edge of our seats throughout. It's satisfying for Ed and Lorraine too, being characters in this film hesitant to push themselves due to fears from the past. A vision Lorraine had that caused her to lock herself away for days during an exorcism was the perfect showcase of how dangerous the lifestyle is for them. So when we realise that Ed's going to take it on himself, we feel that paranoia that Lorraine feels as well. We care for these two. Having seen the footage with Maurice and Annabelle also helps establish them as characters within this world, and it sets the stage for their approach here. And the warm ending really works, with these two clearly being the heart of the film, and they take up even bigger roles in films after this. And I do want to actually mention that Annabelle is actually a decent presence in this film, and it's probably the most effective that she's ever used. She's not overused at all. Bathsheba kind of uses that to her advantage to get to Ed and Lorraine, and it works really well. Overall, we end up with a highly effective and highly satisfying horror film, with great scares, pretty good characters, and an engaging story. The sequel improves on almost everything from the first.
This is as close to hell as I ever want to get.
The scares, the characters, the story, everything is just turned up to 11. I'll admit there's some repeated territory, but I don't really mind because the film shows them in a new light and develops them. We follow the Enfield haunting in this film, but the first thing we actually witness is the Amityville horror, a very famous case and a very effective way to open the film, because it makes us question how can it possibly get worse than this. We see a seance in the home and an effective tone-setting opening sequence, as well as an effective introduction to the nun, who is later revealed to be the primary antagonist. It's easy to forget that she's actually a scary, effective force in this film. The franchise desperately try to spin her off and make her a real big bad with 2 solo movies, but in this film alone, I think it works really well. Creepy imagery and a constant presence. The actual form of a nun has a great narrative relevance, showing its knowledge to be able to attack Ed and Lorraine's faith. A direct challenge almost to Lorraine specifically, and I love that it's a demon who has specifically chosen a look for this reason and to attempt to scare Lorraine, and it also makes us think what is its true form, forcing us to see something that is normally holy involved with something so unholy and demonic is quite unsettling. I only recently found out how the nun imagery was actually quite a late addition to this film. It was initially meant to be a bigger demon figure, which we do get a glimpse of at the end, and they link this to the first film by revealing that the vision that Lorraine had after exorcising Maurice was actually of Ed's death, the same vision that we saw in Amityville. For me, this enforces the nun as an omnipresent being and adds weight and stakes. Even though it was probably more scary when we didn't know what caused her to lock herself in the room, I don't think it takes away too much for me. But another great detail that we're given is the weapon to defeat Valak at various points throughout the film, and it being her name. We see it spelled out in the background of shots, particularly in the Warrens' home. It continues to give the nun a presence whilst also making it seem smarter. We learn in this film that a demon is compelled to give over its name when asked, as it can give someone power over it. However, knowing this, Valak gives its name as it's compelled to in really subtle and sneaky ways, and I think that's really fucking clever. This time around though, Lorraine is insanely paranoid throughout, knowing that the same being that showed her a vision of Ed's death is directly threatening his life, even now. She is constantly asking Ed for them to take less cases and focus more on lectures, even though they still do want to help people. But this is the thing, the paranoia becomes all controlling. It controls Lorraine throughout the film, and it's only with their time spent with the Hodgsons that we see them develop as a couple, despite their anxieties for one another. I really like seeing the Warrens face adversity in the public eye, which would continue throughout their entire lives and brings a new perspective to this film, as well as an additional challenge for characters to really deal with. It is a bit controversial that the films take this 100% truthful approach. I'm not the biggest fan of that, but I think, like I say, I'm viewing these as pretty much just entirely fictional. I think it works to get us on the side of Ed and Lorraine. And as I say, it's just an interesting new perspective and hurdle. I found the family this time around even better than the parents. When establishing the Hodgsons, it's very accurate to living in Britain.
No, Billy, I didn't get any bloody biscuits because we don't have any bloody money!
In a very similar scene to the first, we have a one shot going through the entire house, seeing the family set up, but even more impressive here, and does a great job at once again bringing us down to the Hodgsons, making them feel real. And I think there's just a larger focus on the Hodgsons as opposed to the parents. Peggy and Janet are the big individual voices, but the family dynamic is also very important. An early scare in the film is Janet sleep talking, saying some weird things and presenting it in a weird voice for half of the conversation. It's weird, but she's a kid, okay? It happens. Which is why it takes a real turn when she starts describing actions in a gory, violent manner with how much detail she goes in. As with the first film, having the Warrens away from the haunting allows us to develop them each separately, building to the eventual convergence, but on an even greater level than the first film. So let's discuss the scares this time around. My house! Each one of them are dragged out as far as possible, begging the tension to release, but only doing so when our guard is down. The lighting is incredibly effective. Blue and black shadows cover the whole house, but we can still see what's actually going on. We never have to really squint unless the film wants us to. A very popular scare was the nun painting, which probably single-handedly spawned her own franchise. But from a story perspective, it crafts this sense of inevitability that all these ideas are going to crash together in some huge horrific way. As a scare, it's also just very creative. The shadow patrolling the room is an excellent visual and a prime example of how they drag the scares out. Sadly, I don't think the release is great. I think seeing the nun holding the painting and roaring is a tad goofy. I love the little interview Ed and Lorraine conduct with Janet where they're turned away, and we see a really subtle transformation through lighting and shadow where Janet actually embodies Bill Wilkins, and it's a transition that happens so slowly and it's all out of focus. I loved that scene, but The Crooked Man was another huge highlight, a clear showcase of the huge budget increase this time around, and I adore the way they showed this through the stop motion movement after the dog transforms. It is expertly done, and this is one of the spin-offs I really wish we had gotten, because this thing is fucking terrifying and I want to see it do more. But the scare escalates well, with Janet appearing around the corner with the booming voice. A subversion. It's not just Janet sleepwalking, it's not the Crooked Man, it's Janet. And it leads to a gate flying across the room as Janet falls to the floor, seizing. It's a huge breaking point and is the perfect entry point for the Warrens to come through. They really are a shining light in all the films and the reason for the series' success, really.
I don't think I can sleep this far away from you.
Well, you're gonna. It'll give you something to look forward to when we get home.
But in world, to each of these families, they are also the same thing. They actively emotionally support the family. There isn't just the job of learning about potential demons to exorcise, but helping the residents to cope and get through a mentally exhausting and traumatic time. The best example of this being the singing scene with Ed. A heartwarming moment that's a real moment of levity amongst a pretty dire film, and this film has some really funny jokes at times.
It's so small and light.
But generally, it's quite a down, low-feeling movie. But essentially, the Hodgsons had all of their records taken after their father left them, so Ed and Lorraine went out to buy some, only to find out that the table doesn't even work, leading to Ed taking up the role of Elvis and singing Can't Help Falling in Love. It's a beautiful scene for him and the Hodgsons. It's really emotional, especially if you look at Peggy's face throughout, but also the way Ed is singing to Lorraine in this moment. It's just so heartfelt and heartwarming, and these are the moments that make these films so fucking good. A moment that reinforces their love at a time where Lorraine is especially consumed with paranoia, but no matter what, they will always be by each other's side, and I think it's somewhat of an acceptance of the risks from Ed in this scene. As the Warrens need authentic evidence to give the church for permission to have an exorcist come down to perform, especially with the media attention that this case specifically is getting, the church need to know it's real, because if they're seen to help out on a hoax, that obviously affects the church's reputation. But something weird that Lorraine has felt since coming into the picture here is that she's not felt any kind of presence. Despite believing the pain through talking and knowing the family, Lorraine doesn't feel anything supernatural, doesn't feel anything demonic. And before bearing witness to any hard evidence of the supernatural, a camera catches Janet herself throwing knives across the room, which from the outside is very obviously a bad look. As the Warrens state, the church takes one look at that and they won't go anywhere near it, so they end up leaving. Both of them feel weird about this. Their hearts are with the Hodgsons, but this is essentially proof that there's nothing going on. So upon getting on the train to leave, Lorraine notices after they drop some tapes, two of them cross over, and that gives her the inkling to listen to them together. And this is an excellent twist where we find out that all this time, Bill Wilkins has been a pawn for the nun. It adds a true layer of empathy to Bill Wilkins as a ghost who is being used, not allowed to pass on to the afterlife properly. And it's a really great twist. I love it. Before we round off the sequel, it's important for me to say that these first two films are pretty simple, but they are elevated so much through the handling of scares and especially the characters. And what helps both of these is that they know what they are. They have fun with themselves through little moments that do a lot to allow us to accept some of the more far-fetched and borderline over-the-top horror elements.
The draft do that to your face? I'd take a guy with a gun any day.
And this finale does lean into that a little bit. It's a bit overly digital at times, and there's just a lot going on generally, but it's overall very entertaining and satisfying. Concludes the haunting house narrative within this film, as we see Ed and Lorraine overcome their anxieties by essentially being troopers for God, and through having faith in that and each other, defeat Valak. The ending to this film is probably my favourite of the four as well. Ed places another artifact to be contained in their room with everything else, but suddenly his music from the other room, and we get a borderline creepy feeling, like, oh no, something's still going on here. But it's just Lorraine, awaiting, she's put on an Elvis record, and they embrace in time for Christmas. For me, a very well earned, emotionally resonant ending for the film, and this still remains as my favourite of the four movies, and well, the entire franchise. It has heart, it has scares, and it has fun in another simple yet elevated haunted house horror flick.
Is saving him worth everything you have? Because that's what it may very well cost.
The third title in the mainline films, The Devil Made Me Do It, marked a big shift for the series. Michael Chavez is taking over the director's chair from James Wan.
Speaking today with Michael Chavez.
And before this film, he had done The Curse of La Llorona. And after this, he would do The Nun sequel and the fourth movie. Following James Wan in a horror setting especially is, a pretty impossible task. But you can tell that Chavez is very much inspired and has learned under Wan.
I'm coming at this movie as a fan first. It's because I love the Warrens and I love their relationship. I grew up on horror movies.
And I'm going to say straight off the bat that The Devil Made Me Do It and Last Rites are not in the same league as the first two Conjuring films, but they very much deserve their place in the franchise. And after rewatching all of these films, this one is probably my least favourite. Starting off, we get an excellent exorcism scene though, which is probably the highlight of the film for me, which in a way is to the film's detriment, because we start off at this crazy pace that the film doesn't really keep up through the entire runtime. Also, this film is filled with references more than any of the others to a somewhat distracting degree, because I just start thinking about The Exorcist and The Shining, and I'd rather watch one of those. The shower scare is great, the blood raining down, the disturbing contortions of David Glatzel is highly effective, it's creepy, and is just an opening playground for Chavez to play in, and he brings a lot of his own stuff at times, and it's pretty good. The film has such a nice autumn feel, that is one of its best aspects. The shot composition throughout the colour palette, it really engages us in the locations and surroundings, but the biggest issue with the film is its choice to focus on Ed and Lorraine more. Let me explain. As an idea, I absolutely welcome this. They're the reason we have been watching these films, and they're the reason why I still enjoy this film quite a lot. But in the first act, it takes a similar approach to the first two, getting us to spend time with Arnie and Debbie, but there's a decent time jump between when he inherits the demon possessing David, and so we're left to assume that the last few months everything was just fine. There was an opportunity to really build on a false sense of security here, and give some consequence to Arnie's actions, and I get the idea to put us in his shoes, but I think that's one of the more questionable things in terms of morality in relation to the true stories that this series does. They are real stories, and the likelihood of them actually being related to ghosts and demons is unlikely. But nonetheless, there was an actual murder. Someone actually died. Arnie Johnson actually killed someone. And this film presents him as definitively innocent. It doesn't leave any room for interpretation or discussion. And so it feels a bit weirder this time around. This time spent with Arnie early on also essentially loses all weight after the first act, because he kind of becomes pointless. He just kind of disappears from the film, and we only see him in brief scenes having conversations with his family whilst in prison, almost as if to remind us that, oh yeah, this is who the film's about, by the way. Whilst the investigation that Ed and Lorraine go on is a lot of fun, I can't help but think we should have spent a decent bit more time with Arnie and what he's dealing with, and I think a change that would have hugely benefited the entire film would have been if we saw it from the outside perspective. Imagine seeing Arnie get more erratic and paranoid without us seeing what he sees. It would have been a highly effective build up to the actual murder and could have been even scarier, and would have allowed us that time to focus on Ed and Lorraine, if not Debbie Glatzel, because it doesn't make use of her in the story either. It would have added a layer of mystery to the investigation as the Warrens uncover this Satanist at play. Speaking of the Satanist as a primary antagonist is a very welcome change for the series. It's just something new, and I think it would have been cool to see more of the demon itself and how it's been used by a devil worshipper. That could have been really interesting, and that's another place where we could have spent additional time with Arnie. But as I say, the actual Satanist placing totems under houses and cursing people is an effective threat, and as I say, it's just new, it's just something different, which I always appreciate. A lot of the film is spent trying to find out who this Satanist is, and we actually meet her father, although we don't know that at first, but he's played by the great John Noble.
I have chicken shit on my hands.
He's awesome in the film. He adds some weight and levity as well to the film when we meet him, and he's a pretty effective red herring, coming across as rather sinister, and we almost get the sense that he's hiding something, so when the reveal of it actually being his daughter, that is a genuine twist, as well as serving to build tension into the final act, making us question whether he's been complicit the entire time or if he didn't know, and it just makes us anxious about, is he going to try and protect his daughter, or is he going to help the Warrens to stop her? We get a sequence in the woods where they go to an incident that occurred before the Glatzel case where a girl killed a friend and then said girl was never found. Lorraine uses her senses to discover the girl's body and what truly took place there, and that's where we learn the curses have a process that have to be followed. Once it's established, they must take a life and then their own, which is now the stage that Arnie is at. So they're attempting to break the curse and in effect save Arnie. This whole sequence is pretty well done, but has an insanely digital look to it, with a pretty egregious green screen at the end on the cliff. With the scares this time around, there's some decent work, but for me, the film ends up as a collection of scenes where some are cool, but as a collective, it doesn't really work. Take the waterbed, for example. Cool concept, but it's just such a random scene in the film. It doesn't really have motivation behind it. And I can say that for most of the scares. The moment where the Satanist appears behind Arnie in the window, it's solely there for the audience to point and say, ooh, spooky stuff's happening. A simple change would have been that she just doesn't move, because that way Arnie turns around and actually sees her, and that builds up a sense of impending doom and a more unique scare. The final act is fine, with some cool visuals once again, and whilst everything with Arnie is pretty over the top, I do really like the contortioning, and it feels high stakes and all of that. I love the death of the Satanist as well. It's pretty brutal, having the demon take her soul instead after Ed breaks the altar she'd been using to curse victims, and there's some fun to be had within this sequence, especially the mirror scene. But once again, the film ends on a very warm note focused on Ed and Lorraine embracing, and we're left with a weird entry in the series, where I appreciate its attempts at new ideas, a lot of them come off empty and uninspired in execution. Whilst I totally welcome the focus on Ed and Lorraine, it detriments so much else of the film that we end up with something that couldn't decide what it truly wanted to be, so it ends up as a final product that's not much more than just a fun, schlocky horror at times.
Saint Michael, defend us. Be our safeguard against the devil.
In nomine Patris, et Filii et Spiritus Sanctus.
We finally reached the end of the Conjuring movies, which, after its first weekend, immediately proved this franchise isn't going anywhere. The name very much still had value to it. Whilst I get the want to keep this train going, I think even if we were to do a prequel, having Wilson and Farmiga are essential in some capacity, because that's what kept this series together. That's what kept us coming back, and without them, I don't think there is any reason to come back. And the same extends to James Wan, even if it is in a producer role. Obviously that's kind of where he's been sat after the first two films. but I could get behind a prequel, absolutely. Honestly, with the actors playing the younger versions of the characters in the opening to this film, they did a great job. Give us a HBO show where every episode is a different case that's tackled over about an hour. Hell, start with the first episode being the full dedicated episode to their first demonic case, the mirror. The flashback opening surprised me, but I think the two actors cast do a great job, and it's legitimately a pretty thrilling opening that had me hooked. Whilst I think the miracle of bringing Judy back after praying is borderline a bit too far, but I think it just about makes it work because it is a horrifying opening. It's one of the scariest parts of the film for me. Obviously, we know that Judy survives, but I was thinking, oh, is this going to be another child that they'd lost or something? I didn't know. And it's harrowing to see them go through this. And in this world where the likes of prayer and faith works and is a vital thing, I can get behind it just enough. And this film spends a lot of time with the Warren family, more so than the previous, and I think balances it much better now, because also Judy is grown up now. And I find myself just as engaged in the scenes where they're just sat talking as I am with the scares. A large chunk of the film is spent with Judy's boyfriend attempting to earn, particularly Ed's blessing, and they lead to genuinely emotional moments that have even more weight thanks to that opening. All in all, this film is made as a goodbye with the characters who have driven the movies and kept us invested. Ed still runs the risk of a heart attack throughout the film, meaning they have essentially given up taking cases altogether, despite Father Gordon's attempts to rope them back in. Gordon isn't the only crossover from past films. There's an Avengers Endgame cameo fest at the end, but we find ourselves meeting Brad once again from the first film, and moments like these honestly do feel earned for the series, including James Wan getting a decent bit of camera time at the end. Back to the actual movie though. This film sees the Smurls tormented by a demon, a case I'd never personally heard of, opposed to the last two movies that I think were particularly famous. When the grandfather brings the same mirror that Ed and Lorraine dealt with years ago, still with the same crack left from Lorraine, weird, sinister stuff starts consuming the household. First big thing of note being a whole ass light falling onto the kitchen table, with one of the few jump scares that genuinely got me. So yes, speaking of the scares, I sadly feel this might be the weakest in that regard. Although, granted, there are some genuinely great ones in here, and they're all pretty fun consistently, but they just didn't get me anywhere near as much as some of the others had. The Smells attempt to bring attention to the activity through publicity because they aren't getting anywhere with the help that they've received, and when Father Gordon visits and witnesses firsthand how the holy water burns into steam in the basement, he's prevented from actually giving the information to the church because the demon takes his life, and this obviously affects the Warrens as he has been a constant person helping them in life. His death is a big weight on them, including Judy, which is where the paths begin to converge again. Judy inherited a similar sense to Lorraine, but is much less experienced with dealing with it. She's trying her best, but this allows her to feel something wasn't right about Father Gordon's death. And the little phrase she says is actually a big part in what I recently found to be Vera Farmiga's band.
Do not get lost in pocket. You found it. Not a penny was there in it, only ripping round it.
Coincidence? I think not!
I literally found it like the day after I saw this film, and my mind was blown. The first song I listened to was Illusion. The band is called the Yagas. I actually really recommend it. I've become a fan. I've become a big fan. But anyway, Judy in the film decides to investigate on her own accord, which leads her to the Smurls. Even she doesn't fully know what's drawing her in at this point, but Lorraine has a vision signifying the danger that Judy is in. So her, Ed, and Judy's boyfriend make their way down to Pennsylvania. Similarly to the last one, Chavez really engages us in location, and at the Smells house it really feels like this urban, left to rot, forgotten location. But Ed and Lorraine want to take Judy and go back home, but she's so drawn to this case that she manages to convince them to stay. Lorraine is immediately aware of something otherworldly in the house, and they are slowly able to deduct the multiple spirits as well as an unseen demon, pulling the strings behind the faces of these spirits. It leaves us with a sense of inevitable dread of what happens when the Warrens see it. For the audience, knowing that the mirror is here, it adds a sense of inevitable dread of what's going to happen when the Warrens encounter it, and it is just another thing that makes this feel like a real grand finale. As for the Smells, I think they're fine. I think I'm invested more than the Johnsons, but this film is much more interested in the Warrens' personal story. We just don't get a bunch of time with the Smells before the haunting starts, so there's no real change that we see. But one of my favourite scenes of the film is when one of the girls starts puking blood and it turns out she starts spitting out glass after they try and throw the mirror away. That was a brilliant scene, I loved that. And there are specific sequences and scenes like that throughout the film that show Chavez has a great talent. I was just never as engaged in their dedicated parts of the film as a family. A highlight scene for me was when Ed and Tony have a conversation, and Tony used to be a police officer, and when he discovers why he left, we get a great insight to the life in parenthood, specifically obviously Ed and Lorraine's, and how that horror of thinking that their daughter may be dead has affected them in all aspects of life. Ed and Tony really bond over that value of life and love for Judy, and I thought that was a really nice scene. Generally, it's the same proceedings in terms of pacing. Things ramp up even more after the Warrens' arrival, and throughout the film, we'd seen the demon getting close to Judy. The mirror scare is pretty great, just ruined by the trailers because it was everywhere. But once in the house, the demon baits Judy using Lorraine's voice and actually does possess her. Everyone is separated, Lorraine with one of the spirits in the basement and Ed with heart issues. There's some great cinematography in an awesome one shot that goes above the house and back into it. I mean, it borderline feels like a Michael Bay movie. But with Judy's condition worsening and seemingly every element being against them, they fail to transport the mirror out of the house, and it starts levitating and feels huge and eerie. It becomes an active threat itself. It has the Warrens and Tony cornered in this hallway as it forces them back. Tony trapped under the mirror, leading to some pretty gruesome effects as it scrapes his leg. Ed had begun the exorcism, and the film does a great job of making the act of exorcising a genuine challenge, with the flames on the Bible and the crucifix, the mirror looking like it's about to drop some WWE moves on these guys. All this blockbuster stuff makes it a really climactic and effective ending before, in working together as a family, they are able to banish the demon back, saving Judy and the smells and taking the mirror with them. The power of love is once again the savior, but I think this film earns that ending, even if it is a bit cheesy and obvious. But the final scene of the film is Judy and Tony's wedding, where we see all these familiar faces from these movies, and the final shot of the franchise is Ed and Lorraine dancing together in a very fitting finale to what is their story. So the Conjuring franchise probably isn't over. However, I think it is as we know it. There's no arguing that the series has been a huge success, and I think it deserves to have made the impact it has. I mean, it's been going since 2012, and there's been 9 movies making bank, breaking records. The series has left an impact, and whilst a lot of the spin-offs didn't reach the mediocre threshold, there's still merit to them, particularly with Annabelle Creation, which I think is easily the best of the spin-offs. And there are things to enjoy in Annabelle 3 and The Nun 2, and even La Llorona, if you want to count that as a Conjuring movie. But the 4 Conjuring films, whilst yes, a big change after the second one, as much as I don't totally love 3 and 4, I think they're still good, and I still enjoy them both. So the Conjuring franchise is probably the most successful horror franchise of all time, and it's easy to see why. And personally, I've had a great time watching these movies as they've come out over the last few years and watching them with different friends. James Wan really created something special here, and if they are going to take it on further, I just hope they do it well. Otherwise, I think Last Rites is a pretty great ending for the series. But that about does it for the Halloween special this year. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in and watching. It didn't all go to plan. I had some personal issues at the end of September, which halted a lot of what I wanted to do. But I've tried my best to push through and get out what I can, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it nonetheless. And I hope you have too. I hope you've been watching scary movies and enjoying the month of October. And you already know I'm going to be talking horror through a lot of the year anyway, until hopefully we get to do this next October. So with nothing else to say about the Conjuring movies, that's about it. Take care, guys.